Welcome, everyone. Our first speaker is Dr. Anthony Witcher, who is an associate professor at the Tennessee State University Otis Floyd Nursery Research Center. With a background in horticulture, Dr. Witcher is dedicated to developing sustainable practices for ornamental crop production. The focus of his research is to address major issues in nursery crop production, with an emphasis on weed management, cover crops, and alternative soil substrate amendments. Current projects include evaluating alternative weed control methods for nursery crop propagation and production, evaluating cover crop establishment and management in field grown nursery crops, evaluating alternative substrate amendments for improved crop quality and reduced pesticide use, and screening new herbicides for crop safety and efficacy. Welcome, Anthony. The floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you, Bodie. Let's see here. Let me get my slideshow up. There we go. Can y'all see it okay?
Perfect.
Looking good.
All right, let's good. Thank you. Thank you for having me. Good afternoon, everyone. Today I'll be talking about alternative weed control practices in nurseries and propagation. Just a couple of objectives, kind of go over a summary of overview of the weed management practices in nursery production and propagation, talk about a few alternative weed control methods, and if we have time, just kind of go over a few troublesome weeds we've been seeing. Give you an overview of nursery production. So I'm in Tennessee, and so I know in Georgia it's pretty similar, but we have three main types of nursery production systems that are used here. We have field grown, which, trees are just grown straight in the field soils, container grown, and pot. And each of these systems kind of takes a slightly different method of weed management. And so first off, I'm going to kind of show you some good examples of weed management practices that I've found around here. And so we'll start in the field. Here's a field of some conifers, and they've got, these are field grown. And, what we pretty much recommend is keeping the rows clean. So having like about a 2 foot wide band all the way down the row that's weed free, and then keeping something green in the middles. It could be grass, it could be weeds, it could be cover crop, really anything, just to keep the soil in place, to keep it from eroding, and also and to keep the rows clean, just to keep the weeds from competing with your crop. And so there's another nice field of boxwood, clean middles, and then real nice grassy middles. A lot of our nurseries use basically just whatever comes up in the middles, and then they just mow that periodically just to keep it from getting too out of hand. Here's a nice example of a container nursery. Nice clean containers, no weeds in the pots, and then also a nice gravel pad with no weeds. And similar here. So this is kind of what we're looking for. Also, here's a pot and pot operation. So not only do we need to keep the weeds in the containers clean, it's a good idea to kind of keep a strip down the row clean, just to prevent any weeds from throwing seeds into the containers. And so this is kind of what I recognize as really good practices for weed control. Now we'll go into some maybe not so recommended practices. So this is a nice field of mature trees, red maple trees, and it looks really nice. It's really good habitat for bees and pollinators, but not so much when we're trying to reduce, competition with our trees. These are more mature trees, so it's, less of an issue when you've got weeds and cover crops growing in the rows. But when you have real small plants, any kind of weed or grass or anything growing in that row is going to compete with your crop. So it's going to take moisture, it's going to take fertilizer, and it's going to potentially outgrow it and take over the space and really reduce the growth of your crop. And so there's been a lot of work done with that, and shows that really anything you have growing in the row is going to reduce your crop size and slow its growth. And so and then also, here's another example of a vine that's kind of gotten out of hand. And so we do recommend using cover crops in nursery production, but something like this is a hairy vetch, which is a real common cover crop in other cropping systems. So in like vegetables and agronomic crops, good. So it's a legume. It grows pretty well. It's pretty aggressive. It makes a lot of biomass. But when you put it into a nursery situation, it can cover up a shrub, a small shrub, or a small tree really fast. And so we really just need to keep these types of weeds in check. And in a container system, I mean, this is kind of an example of just one or two grass weeds. This is goose grass. Just one or two weeds can quickly overtake a plant in a gallon, a gallon or 2 gallon plant, and quickly outcompete it. And so, and then it eventually dies. And so we try to prevent these things. And again, we've got a nursery here who's got a little bit of an overwatering issue, and they've got a nice little collection of different weeds in there. And so, over time, these weeds or they're gonna compete for water, compete for nutrients, and then just really slow down the growth of the plant. Also, it just doesn't look good when you're selling the plants. And so I know a lot of growers will come in and remove those weeds before they ship them, but they're already giving the plant to the customer, but also giving them a lot of weed seeds to go along with it. And so we're trying to avoid that. And so that's in production, and so we have a lot of growers that where do these plants come from? If we're potting up plants into containers or replanting them in the field to grow them into a mature size, we have to buy in liners, propagated material, and we have a number of nurseries here in Middle Tennessee that's all they do is grow propagated material. It could be seedlings that are grown in the field or in containers. And so a lot of our crops are grown from seedlings. So a lot of our shade trees like oaks, certain maples, and then also a lot of root stocks that are grown for grafting later on. So like dogwoods, redbud, a lot of fruit tree seedlings are grown here. And so a lot of propagated material comes out, and surprisingly enough, there are weed issues in propagation. And then we also have a lot of nurseries that grow plants from cuttings. And so a lot of our shrubs and small trees are propagated via cuttings. They could be done in the field. We got several nurseries here that do it the old school way. They have raised beds, and then they just stick cuttings in those raised beds. They have mist systems in the field, and they'll grow them like that. But most of them are done in containers, typically in shade houses or in greenhouses. Okay, here we can kind of see a picture here. The picture on the left is just a bed of cuttings in the field, and then the two on the right are just one in the shade house and one in a greenhouse. And the problem is, weed control begins in propagation. Because even though we think we're starting with, maybe clean potting mix and other, a really clean area that you're doing this in, weeds can get established very quickly. And so, and also when we're propagating liners, they may be done, but they sit for several months, and that's an opportune time for weeds to kind of move in. And then once you ship those out, there's already weed seeds in there, and you're already going to share them with the customer. And so even when you remove weed seeds or weeds before shipping, there's already hundreds or thousands of seeds already in there. Here on the left, you can kind of see an area. This is in a propagation area where the wheat bittercress is growing just in the walkway right near where the cuttings are being grown, and those weeds can just easily get flung into the containers. And this picture on the right here, you can see is a flat. This is actually a flat of crepe myrtles that I just received last week. And it already has hundreds of little bittercress seedlings in it. And so these things start very quickly. And then once we transplant those into a new container, then we're already going to have a weed problem. And so why are weeds, why are they such an issue? Well, it's because they're just really good at what they do. I mean, most of the weeds we deal with are annuals. They germinate really fast, they flower quickly, and they can make seeds within a few weeks. And they make a lot of seeds. So like a typical bittercress plant, it can make up to 5,000 seeds per plant. Crabgrass, one plant can make over 150,000 seeds in one season. And so they're just really good at spreading themselves around and hanging around. And they're also really good at not just making a lot of seed, but also dispersing that seed. And so depending on the weed, it could be dispersed by wind. Like dandelions, they've got a little nice little white pappus on there. Horseweed the same way. Those seeds can get lifted up in the air, and they can travel for miles and miles and miles. Some seeds float in water. They'll be dispersed by streams. Animals spread them around. And then my favorite is explosive dehiscence. And so, like bittercress and wood sorrel are two plants that are really good at that. And so they have this natural mechanism. So when the seed pods mature, any kind of thing like wind or just walking by and brushing them, those pods will pop open, and they'll fling their seeds several feet. And so they're really good at that. And so that's why we always constantly have issues with weeds. Let me get rid of this to get it out of the way. Put it over here. There we go. And so not only do they just make a lot of seeds, they make a lot of plants. This is what they can do to your crop. And so this picture on the left is just an example. This was at a field day in North Carolina. Dr. Joe Neal was kind of demonstrating how different frequencies and weeding could affect your plant growth. And so the plant on the left was an abelia plant, and those plants were weeded every 2 weeks. And so they have somebody walk around and make sure to pull out all the small weeds every 2 weeks. And 2 weeks, and so it's a nice full plant. And the two on the right, two plants on the right, those were weeded like every 4 or 6 weeks. And so just by leaving those weeds in those containers, you can see the reduced growth from those abelia, and see just the pile of weeds that are in front of it. And that's how quickly those weeds grown. If you look at the pictures on the right, these are just some weed seeds that I collected and we planted. And you can see just from the compared from the top to the bottom picture, that's just like a 2 or 3 week difference. That's how fast these weeds grow. And so once they get established, they take off and grow really fast, and they can quickly outgrow your crop. And so this is another reason we need to keep these under control. Where do weeds come from? And so they come from everywhere, basically. And so they can come from adjacent fields, production areas, other containers. And so if you've got a weedy block of plants, across the driveway over there or across the road, those weeds can easily float into the clean blocks. They can come from potting mix, your container substrates, if it's not stored properly. Weeds can get in the pile, and then once you start using it, mixing it up, those weed seeds are already there, and they've got a nice little head start. Plant liners, like I just showed you. Irrigation water, if you're pumping water out of a pond or even streams, there's already weed seeds in there, and they can potentially be spread out through your irrigation system. And then just equipment, so mowers, tillers, anything like that. We're just spreading seeds around. So the first defense against weed issues is just using sanitation practices. Properly storing your container substrate. So if you've got a bark pile that's outside, make sure it's on a concrete pad with walls potentially, and making sure that any water there is, drains off, and then you try to have walls up to keep the weed seeds from blowing in. You try not to, or do not reuse substrates. And so I know a lot of people do this. Not only will you have weed seed problems, but you'll also have a lot of root soil-borne disease problems too. Because probably while you're reusing that, it was dumped out of a container from a plant that died or something like that, and so it already probably had issues to begin with. And so don't reuse substrates. Also, try not to reuse containers. And if you do, make sure you wash them off really well, or sanitize them, sterilize them pretty well, because a lot of these seeds have sticky coatings. And so, like bittercress, oxalis, those seeds just stick to the side of the pot. And so they're just transferred from one crop to the other. And also make sure to control weeds in surrounding areas. So drainage ditches, grassy areas that are, surrounding the container pads, anything that pops up on the container pad, just go ahead and make sure those are cleaned up. So first off, I'm just kind of go over some common, control methods that we have for each type of production system. So for container grown crops, we have hand weeding, which is not ideal, but it's, we have to do that every now and then. We're going to have weeds that break through, so you're going to have workers go through and periodically hand weed plants, but we'll try to limit that as much as possible. We can use mulches in containers. There are some pros and cons to mulches, but though they are an option. But we all usually the most effective and cost-effective method is by using herbicides. And field grown crops, we also have hand weeding, but with the issues that we have with with just getting labor these days, obviously that's not really a good option. We have cultivation and tillage, which is not something we really recommend. Going back to kind of keeping the middles with something growing in the middles, if we till that area and keep it turned over, well, there's a lot of loose soil there, and you're just asking for, when we get these heavy rains, a lot of erosion can happen, and you're also destroying the structure of the soil. And so it's just not really something we recommend. And then herbicides are really just the best option for weed control in field grown crops. And then in propagation, we are very limited in what we can do to control weeds. So hand weeding is the number one option, because there are just very few herbicides that we can use. And I'll go in that here in a minute. But that's why I have question marks beside herbicides and mulches because there's just herbicides aren't labeled for use in propagation, and also mulches haven't really been tested or tested a lot in propagation. So we really need to get more information on that. Eventually, now we'll just kind of talk about herbicides. So these are the workhorses of the weed management strategies that we have for nurseries. So just kind of go over the general categories of herbicides. So we have post-emergent herbicides. Now they can be a contact type herbicide to where it only damages the part of the plant that it's applied to. And then we have systemic herbicides. So those are absorbed from the leaf and then they translocate it down to the root to kill that plant from the root and do a better job of actually controlling that plant. We also have non-selective and selective. So non-selective herbicides will damage or kill any plant that they are applied to. Selective herbicides may only kill certain types of plants. So it may only damage broadleaf plants or it may only kill or damage grassy or monocots. And so we've got a couple of different options there. And then also we have pre-emergent herbicides. So pre-emergent herbicides are used to prevent the growth and development of seeds. And so we have a couple of different types. So we have spray applied. So those are liquids that are mixed with water and sprayed out over the crop. And then we also have granulars, which are just a dry granule that's actually broadcast over the crop. And so, focusing on post-emergent herbicides, we'll kind of look at some of the popular non-selectives. And so, one of the most or the most widely used herbicide in the world is glyphosate, right? It's Roundup, it's a common name or the trade name. And so, works really well. Works on it controls a lot of different weeds. Works on annual weeds. Works on perennial weeds, and that's why we use it because it is so effective. There's also glufosinate. It's also non-selective. It doesn't quite translocate as well as Roundup or glyphosate, and so it doesn't work as well on perennial type plants, but does a really good job on most weeds. And then we have some selective post-emergent herbicides. So some that work on grasses would be Fusilade 2, Segment, Envoy Plus. Those would be something if you've got a really bad grass problem like crabgrass or Bermuda grass or something like that, you could apply some of these selective grass herbicides. And then if you have a really bad issue with sedges, Sedgehammer and Image or what you could work with. We also have some selective type herbicides that only control broadleaves. Now, obviously, we've got to be really careful when using these around our ornamentals because most of our ornamentals are broadleaf type plants. But there are some scenarios where you want to use these. Say you're growing ornamental grasses and you've got some broadleaf weeds in them, then you could spray these over the top, do a really good job with controlling weeds. And it really depends on which plant you have. So you got to look at the label and make sure that the crops you're applying it to are labeled. But Basagran, TO, Certainty, and Dismiss are a couple of good broadleaf selective options. Now, going back to glyphosate, like I said, it's the most widely used herbicide in the world because it has broad weed spectrum. It's labeled for numerous crops and sites, and it's relatively cheap compared to most other herbicides that we use. There's also a lot of benefits. It's safe to use because it has a low mammalian toxicity. It's non-volatile, and so it doesn't really once you apply it stays where you apply it to on the soil on the plants, and it also has rapid degradation in the soil, so it binds quickly to soil particles. It doesn't leach in the soil, and so we don't see a lot of environmental issues with glyphosate that we do with some other types of herbicides. But there are some issues and concerns. We have glyphosate resistant weed species with all the GMO crops we have, Roundup Ready corn and cotton and all those crops. We've developed a lot of weed species that are resistant to glyphosate. There's also ongoing litigation in regards to claims that it does cause or it causes cancer or contributes to cancer. And so I know you've seen the commercials. They're out there, and actually, there's been several civil trials that the company has lost, and they're appealing, but that's just part of it. And so there is this negative public perception that we have with glyphosate, and that's led to reduced use by homeowners. They see these commercials, they talk to people, they see that it potentially has some of the negative effects on human health, and they just don't want anything to do with it, and that's understandable. That's also led to restrictions and bans from different municipalities. There are certain cities and counties that have actually just banned, totally banned the use of glyphosate. And so that really affects the landscape industry. And so that makes, with landscapers, obviously you've got to come up with some other options or other options for weed control. And also that's bled over into specialty crop production too. So there's a lot of growers, nursery growers, fruit growers, and vegetable growers who have gotten away just to protect their workers or just to not have to deal with any issues with glyphosate. And so we really need to have some really good options for these instances where glyphosate's not available or no one wants to use it. And so I'm going to cover a couple of different terms here, herbicide terms. And so a synthetic is what most herbicides that we use. So glyphosate is a synthetic herbicide, and it's any product that's formulated or manufactured by a chemical process or by process that chemically changes a substance extracted from natural sources. And so it's basically just if it's synthesized, then it's synthetic. And then we also have non-synthetic. Now, these are natural products. And so these are products that are derived from mineral, plant, or animal matter and does not undergo a synthetic process. And so that's kind of the difference between, some of our herbicides that are on the market now. And so when we think about alternatives to glyphosate, there's a couple of different synthetic herbicide options. So glufosinate, I've already mentioned, so trade name Finale, also called Cheetah Pro. It is a synthetic or a systemic herbicide, not doesn't work quite as well on her, perennial weeds like I mentioned earlier, but it is a really good option for glyphosate resistant weeds. It does a really good job with controlling glyphosate, horseweed, and a lot of other weeds. It's best to apply when the weeds are small. The larger the weed, the larger root system that it has, the less effective that it is. And then we also have Dicot Reward as a trade name. And so now it's a contact herbicide. And so you definitely want to target smaller weeds because it will not go down to the root and kill the plant like that. But those are two good options, alternatives to glyphosate on the synthetic side. And then we also have some non-synthetic herbicides that we can use as glyphosate alternatives. And so now these are made from natural compounds. The mode of action is plant desiccant. And so what it does, it breaks down the leaf cuticle. And so it basically just eats away the cuticle on that leaf and disrupts the cell membrane. And so basically the plants just dehydrate. And so that's how they die. It breaks all the liquid and the juices evaporate out of the plant and it kills the plant. It's very effective. A lot of these or some of these products are organic certified, and so you can use it in an organic farming system. Now, the one thing is they are contact herbicides, so you have to really spray the whole plant to make sure that you're getting control or getting damage over the entire plant. And it also these products work better on smaller plants. There are some concerns with these type products, though, is the weed efficacy. We don't really know, have a lot of research on which weeds these products work the best on. In general, the smaller the weed, the better, like 2 to 4 inches tall max, because they get any bigger, they've got a big root system on them. And so even though you kill the shoot part of it, they can regenerate from the roots. And so that's a big issue. Cost is another big issue. These products do cost a lot more than using glyphosate. And then also the actual application rate and application volume. Even though they're labeled for so many, what percentage of material or so many ounces per gallon, we don't really know which rates are effective on which weeds, and also application volume is that there's a big unknown there because they can have a big range from anywhere from 50 gallons per acre to 100 gallons per acre that they may be labeled for. And that's a lot different than when we're using glyphosate, which, we can use at 10 to 30 gallons per acre. And so a lot of differences in using these products than using glyphosate or even glufosinate. To kind of give you an idea on weed control of these products. So on the left, we've got a kind of example of Suppress, one of the organic herbicides. And on the left part of that picture, you can kind of see the weeds that are growing there. Some small weeds, good selection of different weeds there. And on the right, after the application, did a really good job of controlling them. All the broadleaf weeds. Now the yellow nutsedge is still there, and that's understandable because yellow nutsedge is, as we know, is very difficult to control. But did a really good job on the broadleaf annuals. And then on the right, we've got some images from a trial, one of the trials that I did, and the pot that's circled there in red, That was the glyphosate control. And so what I did, we grew these oxalis plants up to about, I don't know, probably 6 or 8 inches tall, and they were flowering at the time. And then we applied the herbicides, and so that was the Roundup treatment. And actually, obviously did a really good job. These, see the one, the circle on the left, that was Reward, I believe, Dicot, and did a really good job. And then the one on the right was, I believe, Scythe. And so one of the non-synthetic herbicides, and so it did a pretty good job. But as you can see from the rest of the containers, not a lot of really good control from those weeds. And at the bottom, you can see these are some crabgrass plants that we had, and the container on the left, that was the Roundup treatment. So obviously 100% control there, but the other ones were with other various non-synthetic herbicides, and they did not do a really good job. Now, initially they did burn the plant back, but they grew back from the weeds. And so these are some issues that we need to be aware of, that if we're using these non-synthetic herbicides, we need to target small weeds and make sure that we're using the correct application rate and application volume. So this is just a list of some of the products that are out on the market, some of the non-synthetic herbicides that are available. And I'm going to highlight three that we know that work pretty well, that we've tested, we've used a lot, and they're commercially available on the market, and a lot of other people have used them, and then they're pretty effective. Scythe, which is made of pelargonic acid. Axe is also another form of pelargonic acid, and then Fireworks, which is a combination of caprylic and capric acid. So these are really effective products. Now there are a lot of other products, and there's some made from acetic acid, some other plant extracts, but these we found work pretty well. Just to give you an idea on the cost comparison, and so we'll put up glyphosate up there. Now this table's a few years old, so it doesn't really take into effect inflation in the last few years. But it's a good, just kind of give you an idea on comparing what a good generic glyphosate would cost per unit. So per 2.5 gallons is about $70. But if you go to buy Scythe, it was about $179, and Axe was about $175. So a good 2.5 times the cost of glyphosate just to buying the product. And that doesn't take into account the actual application rate. And so with glyphosate, we're looking at about $28 per acre it costs to use. Well, with the Scythe and Axe, we're well over 300, up to 350, $377. So over 10 times the amount that it costs to use these products than it does to use glyphosate. And so that's why a lot of these products haven't been adopted, and only the people that just really don't have any other options are using them. But hopefully in time these products will go down in price. Moving on, I'm kind of got to go over just some of the general herbicide use in container grown crops. And so what are some of the practices that we currently use? And so we don't use post-emergent herbicides a lot in container grown crops, obviously, because, we're growing predominantly broadleaf plants. We can't really apply some of these herbicides, or we'll get damage to our crop. But if you've got a grassy weed, so like crabgrass or goosegrass or Bermuda grass or something in your rose crop, rose or whatever other shrub you have, we do have some selective, type grass herbicides you can use to take out the grasses in a broadleaf crop. If you're growing ornamental grasses, you can use some of these selective broadleaf herbicides to take out the broadleaf weeds out of that crop. Or you can do spot sprays, typically in large containers or in pot and pot. We can use a mix of glyphosate or some other non-selective type herbicide in those situations. But we're pretty limited in using post-emergent herbicides. And so really the best option we have is using pre-emergent herbicides in container grown crops. As I said before, there's a couple of different formulations. There's granular and sprayable. So with the granular type products, the pros are it's safe. It's safer on most crops. You apply it, broadcast it out with a belly grinder over the crop, and then usually the granules just fall off the leaves and into the container, and so that's pretty safe. The cons are typically these products are more expensive and they're difficult to apply evenly because we have to calibrate a belly grinder type spreader. Not only do we have the cranking going on, and but then you also have the walking speed, and so those combinations can make it really difficult to apply the proper amount of herbicide over that area. Now, some larger nurseries have invested in some larger kind of boom type tractor driven up applicators for granulars. But it really depends on the resources and how your nursery is laid out to whether you can have to do it manually or through some type of automated application. Um, Sprayable pre-emergent herbicides also have some pros and cons, and so they're typically less expensive. You can apply them more evenly because it's easier to calibrate a backpack sprayer or a tank sprayer than it is to calibrate a broadcast a granular sprayer. And you can also make custom combinations. So you can pick a pre-emergent herbicide that's really strong on grasses, mix that with an active ingredient that's really strong on broadleaf weeds, and then you've got a really good broad spectrum type product there to take care of a lot of your weed issues. One of the cons is they may damage certain crops. So when you're spraying that over the top of your crop, some of these products do tend to burn the leaves. And so that's something you need to be aware of. So either you need to do some directed sprays or make sure to turn the irrigation on after you make the application. And so mulches are an option in container grown crops. The pros are, some crops just are really sensitive to herbicides. So take hydrangea, for example. There's not hardly, maybe one or two pre-emergent herbicides that are safe to use or labeled to use on hydrangea. And so a lot of growers have gone to use rice hulls as a mulch on that crop because they're so sensitive to these herbicides. And also, no pre-emergent herbicide is labeled for use inside of a greenhouse. And so mulches are a really good option for when we're growing perennials or other crops inside of a greenhouse where you can't use herbicides. The cons of mulches is there's extra labor to apply the mulches. So you either have to do it right after you transplant it. You also got to make sure to leave a gap in the top of the pot, maybe about an inch and a half at least, for the mulch to fit into the container. And so then the labor of applying them, they're also more costly. They're going to be a lot more expensive to use than herbicides. And in this picture, I just kind of have an example of a trial that we did last year looking at rice hulls, which is the kind of the standard mulch that we're using in container production. So, and then also you have the option of different pine bark mulches. So there's pine bark shredded mulch, there's pine bark nuggets, mini nuggets. And then I've been working with different pelletized materials. So pine pellets appear on the top left. And I'll kind of show you here in a minute a little bit more detail on that. So looking at some different options for using different types of materials as a mulch in containers. One of the things with rice hulls, they work really great for weed control, especially inside a greenhouse. Once you get them outside of the greenhouse, get them outside an open area, the wind, if you get really windy times, they can blow out of the pot and really create a mess and not be as effective. So that's kind of why we're looking for some other alternatives for using mulches outdoors. So not only do we want to look at, in that study we were looking at that the mulch has had any effect on plant growth. We also want to make sure that they actually work to control weeds. And so this is part of that same study. And we can see here, this is the control. So this is a container with just crabgrass in it, no herbicide, no mulch or anything. And so this is about 4 or 5 weeks in. And so you can kind of see there's a good many grass plants in there. And then these are the pine bark mulches. And so what we did, we had two different mulches, and we applied the weeds. We applied the weed seed underneath the mulch and on top of the mulch. And so some of the pots we sowed the weeds in there, and then put the mulch on top of it. And the other ones we actually sowed the weed seeds on top of the mulch. And the pine bark mulches aren't really working that well. Those crabgrass seeds, they germinated and they're already growing. But if you look at the rice hulls, that's the red circles on at the top, and then the pine pellets, the two circles at the bottom. They did a really good job of preventing that weed seed from growing. And so this is what we're looking for. We want something that's going to be really effective at keeping those weed seeds from germinating. When we talk about using herbicides in field grown crops, I have a couple of different options. So we can use post-emergent herbicides in field-grown crops, specifically if you have a shielded type sprayer. A lot of our growers here in Middle Tennessee, they exclusively just use post-emergent herbicides in their field crops. So they'll take glyphosate or glufosinate, and then they'll make several applications a year. And that's kind of one of the drawbacks. You have to make probably 4 or 5 applications through the field, throughout the growing season to really keep those weeds in check because they're going to kill the weeds, but those weeds are just going to come grow back within a few weeks. And so works real well. You just have to make more applications. But then the growers that are using pre-emergent herbicides, they may be able to get away with only making 2 applications a year. I've seen some growers make a fall application and then come back and do a spring application, and that really takes care of most weeds throughout the growing season. If we're looking to control broadleaf weeds, simazine and oxazoxaben are the two main active ingredients that work really well for a large number of broadleaf weeds. When we're talking about controlling grassy weeds, these are some of the active ingredients that work well. Now, I know I have a Riesland, a Surfland on there, but it's my understanding that we won't be able to get Surfland in the near future or if ever, unless you already have it in stock. And so some of the other herbicides that work well for grassy weeds are pendimethalin, prodiamine, dithiopyr. And what we recommend, is mixing one of the broadleaf active ingredients with the grass active ingredient so you can get broad spectrum control. But we also have some active ingredients that do well on their own. So flumioxazin, Sureguard, and Dazaflan, which is Marengo, and dimethamid P, which is Tower. These can be used alone and provide really good broad spectrum control of a lot of different weeds. And when we're talking about applying these post-emergent or pre-emergent herbicides in the field, a couple of different application methods. So a lot of growers are still using enviromist sprayers, and so that's a sprayer that makes a real fine mist, and it's under a shielded, a hooded sprayer. That's ultra low volume, so you're not using a lot of water. But that means you can only apply post-emergent herbicides, and so you can't go in and mix a pre-emerge with that. And so it works well if you only want to apply glyphosate or glufosinate, and just know that you're going to have to make several trips in the field throughout the year. A lot of growers are starting to use just standard nozzles, and then that way it's just a standard flat fan nozzle. But if you put a shield on that, you can actually make a combination spray of a post-emergent and a pre-emergent. And that way you're taking care of any actively growing weeds that are in that row, but you're also putting down pre-emerge to help prevent any more weeds from coming through. And so this is a really good option. You can kind of see these tractors, these two pictures at the bottom, just a standard nozzle underneath that hood, and they have a rubber kind of a boot on there. And they're spring loaded. And so you just drive down each side of the row, makes a nice, good 18-inch band on each side of the row. They work really well. And then if you just wanted to put out pre-emerge, you could use a band type sprayer without a shield on it for the most part. But these are really good options for doing weed control in field grown crops. So moving on to now, I've kind of talked about the different options that we have in container grown and field grown crops. Let's talk about what are our options in propagation. And so the number one thing that we need to do in propagation is to use sanitation as much as possible. So, managing the floors of the propagation area would be the first start. And so if you have a shade house or a greenhouse that has a gravel floor, making sure to kill all the weeds in there before you even start the propagation process. Several different post-emergent herbicides are labeled for even using inside greenhouses, as long as you're not applying it obviously not applying it to your crop. Scythe, Reward, Finale, Roundup are all labeled for use inside greenhouses and work really good for cleaning up weeds in gravel floors. There's also a couple of different pre-emergent herbicides that you can apply inside of a greenhouse as long as you do it before you move the flats or the containers inside the greenhouse. And so indaziflam and flumioxazin are really good options for this. And so put those down about probably a good 3 weeks before you move any plants in there. Give that product time to volatilize and kind of settle in into that area, and then move the plants in, and that'll give you good long residual control throughout the wintertime. So going back to some of the issues that we have in propagation, the reason we don't use herbicides in propagation, well, number one, there's no herbicides specifically labeled for use in propagation. And that's for good reason. There are some herbicides that are root inhibiting. They actually prevent root development. And so specifically plants in the dinitroaniline class of herbicides. So arizolan, pendimethalin, prodiamine, trifluralin, those do not need to be used anywhere, any kind of in seedlings or cutting propagation or anything, because they will damage the roots and potentially kill the plant. But there are some non-root inhibiting type pre-emergent herbicides that are available that have shown in previous research and some of the research I've done to be really safe in seedling and in cutting propagation. So components like oxidizing, which is Ronstar, Regal OO, which is a combination of oxidizing and oxyfluorophane, and then also Gallery, which is isoxaben. And so there's some potential there to use those in propagation. Now, there are some challenges. So in addition to there not being labeled specifically for propagation, some of these herbicide labels have restrictive language on there to even prevent you from using them. As I said before, you can't use any pre-emergent herbicides in enclosed structures. But a lot of the propagation that goes on is done in hoop houses or shade houses, and so herbicides, pre-emergent herbicides, can be used in those situations as long as it's under a shade cloth and you've got open air going through there. But some of the products limit use in small diameter containers, so maybe you can't use in containers less than 4 inches in diameter. And they may also say specifically do not use on non-rooted cuttings. So those are the ones that obviously those are the products you want to stay away from. But there are some exceptions to the rules, and so there are some products that don't have this restricted language, and we have seen through our research that have shown that they are safe for using in propagation. So there are some opportunities. There's have been some newer pre-emergent herbicides that have come on the market, and over the last few years that haven't been really evaluated in propagation. So like flumioxazin and dazaflam, we need to find out if these are safe in propagation. But we also need to find alternatives to pre-emergent herbicides, because if you are propagating inside of a greenhouse or if you're propagating very sensitive plants, we need to use something. We need to have options, and so mulches are a really good option. We know rice hulls work well in container production, but no one's really tested them in propagation, like under intermittent mist in a really moist situation. Like how well do they work? And also pelleted materials that I was alluding to earlier. So like pine pellets. We know when I started doing research in propagation, I wanted to find some materials that we could try out to see if they would work for preventing weeds and propagation. I found these pelletized materials, so paper pellets, pine pellets. These are actually products that are marketed for animal bedding. But you apply them as a solid pellet, but as they hit water, as they're saturated in water, they actually expand and break down and make a really good barrier over the surface of the container. So I decided to try them in research and compare it to rice hulls, which has been the standard for using mulches in container production. So these are some plants from a trial that I did. I actually tested several different pre-emergent herbicides and the two different mulches, rice hulls and pine pellets. And if we're looking at crepe myrtle, we can see we had pretty good root development from crepe myrtle. Didn't really see any differences among the different herbicides, and really, or the mulches. Now, with the rice hulls and the pine pellets, we had a slight reduction in root development, but overall, they worked pretty well. This is another study that we did looking at just the mulches. And so we applied them at two different depths. I believe it was a half-inch depth and 1-inch depth. And what we found was as long as you stick to about a half-inch depth at the top of that container, we really didn't see any negative effects of it other than, a slight reduction from the rice hulls, a slight reduction in root development with the rice hulls. And we don't really know why that happened. But we didn't really see any phytotoxicity or anything else that went on from using these mulches. So, it looks like depending on the crop that you're doing, these may be a really good option for using in propagation. This kind of gives you an idea of also, so we tested it to make sure we didn't have any negative effects on rooting. We also want to make sure they actually, control weeds while they're at it. And so if you look at this picture on the left, the top row of containers is just the standard pine bark mix that we're using for rooting the cuttings. And then also below that was the rice hulls. And surprisingly, the rice hulls didn't really do a good job of controlling the weeds like we've seen in container production. And we think that's because we have intermittent mist. We're constantly adding water to the rice hulls. And so where usually they have a hydrophobic layer there, so they don't retain a lot of water, and that's why they work really good. They don't really give the weed seeds any water or nutrients to grab onto. Whereas in propagation, there's always a little bit of moisture there. And so they don't quite work as well in propagation. But the pine pellets and the paper pellets we used did a really good job of keeping these weeds from germinating or from growing. Now, if you do see a lot of green specks in there, so they are growing a lot of weeds. They are germinating, but they don't develop. They don't get any bigger than that because it's basically they starve to death because their roots can't penetrate that layer and get down into the potting mix where the fertilizer is. And so even though there's water there, they don't have any nutrients. And so it works really well in controlling these weeds. And so the bottom picture is crabgrass. And so that's from the, similar, the same study. The ones with the crabgrass growing in it, that's vermiculite, rice hulls, and the potting mix itself. Whereas the paper pellets and pine pellets did a really good job of keeping the weeds from growing. This is a demo we did at a local nursery. And so on the left, you can see the pine pellets. The top of that picture is right after we applied them. And then the bottom part of that picture, the bottom section is actually after they were watered in and they expanded. And you can see they make a nice, real good, solid barrier there. And so the picture on the right is just the grower actually bought a bunch of the pine pellets and then applied them to all of their propagation beds. And that's actually a container. So they propagate in 2.5 inch, 3 inch containers. And so they just apply it over the top of the containers, and they're happy so far with it. And so that's going to wrap up all of my talk on just kind of the alternative herbicides and weed control methods and production, or in nursery production and propagation. If I've got a couple of minutes left here, I'm just going to go over some of the troublesome weeds that I've seen the last few years. And so northern willow herb. This is at a nursery, local nursery. I was called out to see they had this new weed and it was taking over their blueberry crop. And when I got out there, these are the pictures that I took. I mean, what it really was. It gets really tall. It makes these pretty little pink flowers, but it really outcompetes the crop. And it was just on the blueberries. And no, and I wasn't familiar with this weed, mainly because it's not really something that's widely spread in the eastern U.S. It's more of a problem out west. And then I started digging into it. So if I asked them, where they got their blueberry liners from, they said, well, it's from the West Coast in Oregon. And so that made a lot more sense because northern willow herb is a very big problem out in the West Coast. So probably they were already infested with willow herb weed seeds, and so when they got them, they potted them up, and then they had an issue with them. They were using pre-emergent herbicide. It just wasn't working on them. And so what I did a little germination test. Screened a few different products. They were using Snapshot, I believe, which obviously was not working on it. But we ended up testing a couple other materials. So the control here, you can see there's hundreds of small little seedlings in there. So this place was eat up with northern willow herb. But we did find a couple products, Marengo G and Ronstar G, that did a really good job of controlling it. Had another nursery who was having a problem with bittercress inside their shade house, their overwintering house. At first, I thought it was hairy bittercress, but then closer look at it, it was actually a different species, wavy bittercress. Again, they were using herbicides. They were rotating a couple of different herbicides, but they weren't working on them. They said it was just a new problem they just started having. They've been using these herbicides for years, and it only started having the problem just recently. And so I thought, well, it's a couple of different things going on. It could be they could be developing resistance to the herbicide they were using, or it could just be their herbicide. They might not have stored it properly. It could be an old product. So anyway, we put in a test looking at their herbicides, and then I got some new fresh samples of the same herbicides. So this was a Marengo G. So the top picture is non-treated, so it's just the weeds growing out. And then the two Marengo products had a lot of weed seed breakthrough, and so that they obviously do not work on wavy bittercress. The snapshot they were using, a little bit of breakthrough with it, but still a little bit better control. But we found a couple more products that worked a lot better. So Route, Broadstar, OH2. And so these things happen, even though the weeds may not be developing resistance to herbicides, you may be introducing some new weeds into your system that your current herbicides just aren't working on. And so you may just have to start rotating in a different herbicide active ingredient to take care of some of these weeds. So it happens. And so these shifts in weeds that happens over time. We also tested the pine pellets and the rice hulls, and they both did a really good job of controlling the bittercress. Phyllanthus, I know this is a problem, farther south where y'all are at in Georgia. In Tennessee, it's here, but it's not really widespread. But a couple of years ago, I actually found both of the Phyllanthus species, so chamber bitter and longstalk Phyllanthus, they both showed up here at the Nursery Research Center. And I believe it's because somebody had bought some plants, they were infested with both species, and then we started having an issue with it. Luckily, I mean these as you know, most of you probably know, they can spread really fast and make a carpet on the ground. They're a really bad problem in the landscape. But luckily, there are some pre-emergent herbicides that work really well: flumioxazin and dazaflam, oxidizin, oxyfluorophene. And so this is kind of what it looks like when it goes unchecked. And so, but so that's the main thing. Make sure to put the pre-emergent down before these weeds start germinating. And then nostoc, which is not really a weed, it's a cyanobacteria, but it's a safety problem in nurseries. If you work at a container nursery, you've probably seen this. It's really slippery. It's a worker safety issue. It doesn't really not a problem with the plants, but it's more of a safety issue. You can reduce irrigation, reduce nutrient runoff, but if that's not practical, there has been some work done that shows that glufosinate applied at 40 ounces per acre, and you make two applications, that tends to do a really good job of kind of doing away with it, killing some of it and kind of reducing its population. So I think I'm out of time, and so I will take any questions if we have time.
No, you're right on time. In fact, you still had 1 minute.
Okay, okay. Well, darn, I wasted 1 minute, but
All right, I'm opening the floor for questions. Just use the chat or any way you could get the questions to us.
if not, I'll be hanging around till later, so we can try to answer something later if we need to.
I can start us off. I noticed that the paper mulch and the pellets were, like you were showing really clearly, they were very good in suppressing the weeds in the both in the nursery and in the propagation, right? And I was wondering if the I'm sure you put in the same amount of all the mulches, but then when they expanded, it appeared to me that the paper actually had more depth to it. Am I correct in what I was seeing?
So what we tried to do was we left about an inch and a half gap in the top of that container. And so and we actually had to do some preliminary work. We had to measure out the pellets and like one layer of dry pellets and then 1.5 layers and 2 layers to make sure when they expanded, they didn't go over that 1.5 inch gap. And if they did, we were able to just kind of shave them off the top of that. So yeah, all the mulches were applied at the same depth, but it did take a little bit more work with the pellets to make sure that we had it within that depth range, and so we made sure that they were all the same depth. But that's the key with it. I probably didn't mention this, and so when we're applying the pellets, we have to you don't want to overdo it because you can, if you pile it on there, they will expand and get really, they'll blow up like a chia pet, and they'll kind of blow up into your plant, maybe cover some of the stem up. So you got to make sure not to over apply them. So, but yeah, but in my trials, we made sure they were all the same depth. In propagation, we recommend about a 1/2 inch depth of mulch. In production, at least an inch and a half to 2 inches is what's recommended in container production.
Thank you. I was also going to mention if we had time, and I don't see any questions, so I'm just going to keep talking until we run out of time or I see a question. But I actually used just recently on wildflowers, those a product that I have never worked with before, which I just run to the feed store and I got this bedding. And I looked online and there were just some pretty similar products, but they were a whole lot more expensive than just simple bedding for horses. So I just got a whole bunch and I put them out with wildflower seed at Blueberry Farm in Alapaha. So next week I'm going to South Georgia on the farm to look at it. I'm really curious how is it even did it even stay? Because we applied it in December. But just looking at the pictures that you showed from that nursery, clearly they expand, but they probably so, dissolve, if you will. They don't dissolve, but like whatever holds them together, it kind of goes away and then it kind of spread. I'm really curious to see how they performed.
Yeah, I would be interested in that too, because yeah, I haven't done any long-term evaluations, just in like, a couple months in the container. And so in the field setting, I don't know how long they would stick around. So that would be a very good test to see how they did.
All right, we have a question from Eric Fails. Did you say that there are not any pre-emergence labeled for closed greenhouses?
That is correct. So there are no pre-emergent herbicides labeled for closed greenhouses. So we just can't, and that's because, volatility issues. And so if we put these pre-emergents down, some of them are more volatile than others. And so as it heats up inside the greenhouse, especially if you don't have good ventilation, the herbicides can volatilize and actually get on the leaves of your crop and then start causing damage. And so that's the main issue that we run into. And that's why none of the manufacturers will probably ever label them for use inside of an enclosed structure.
But you mentioned that in just straight shade houses, since the ventilation is available, even though to a less degree, products are available or labeled for that use.
Yes, most, if not all, I believe, pre-emergent herbicides are labeled for shade houses. Yes, but because you get the wind through there and you get ventilation, and so it's mainly an issue in enclosed greenhouses. And so, but yeah, you can apply these in shade houses, and that's where most propagation is anyway, is in the shade houses. So
We are at 4 o'clock, so thank you, Anthony.